But here are some of the things that first went through my head this week, and that is, well, the death toll from the shooting in New Zealand now stands at 50 people. Police attribute it to a lone gunman, a neo-Nazi Australian male who also wrote a manifesto spouting many of the same lines and claims made by white nationalists in our own country. The shooting was horrific, but almost as bad was the reaction by some of the political leaders here around the world. Now that was one thing that was bad enough. I could probably deal strictly with that in a sermon. But then there were some other things that came to mind. Tuesday, I read about opposition to a proposed Islamic community center in Overland Park. Almost 500 people signed a petition asking that the proposal be delayed or rejected. And when I read that one, my heart sank. Because Sue and I had already gone through something like this a number of times in New Jersey. During the 12 years we lived there, we saw the same reaction in a number of communities regarding proposed Islamic centers, including the community we lived in. The approach was always the same with each project. They would say that there was going to be a problem with noise, or there was going to be a traffic problem, or it would be a safety issue. Now, because of the congregation we served in New Jersey, the session there had some close relationships with Muslim neighbors. And so the session, as well as Sue and I, were strong advocates for the Islamic Center in our community. And after one zoning meeting where we Presbyterians had once again helped overcome one of the obstacles to the proposed Islamic Center, they took a break. And a woman was outside, and she was quite loud. She was a member of another congregation, and she said, "What is it with these Presbyterians? Do they just want everybody to get along?" Now, I'd only been there a few months, and I quietly, "Hi, yes, we do." But the strange thing is, they got it passed after a lot of fights, court battles, and everything else. They did the renovations on the building, the Islamic Center moved in, and you know what happened? Everything they said never happened. There were no safety issues. There were no noise problems. There was no problems with traffic. In fact, it turned out to be one of the best additions to the community in a long time. And the people who were there did a lot of good charitable works within the community as well, as you would hope any house of worship would do. But then, in connection with all of that, there was another piece of news that I saw this week that I don't know if many of us probably saw. You probably didn't hear about Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi. He's a congressman who heads the Homeland Security Committee in the House of Representatives. And on Wednesday, he sent his third letter. Let me emphasize again, the third time he sent a letter to the FBI and the Justice Department demanding a committee briefing on the evolving threat of domestic terrorism after earlier requests of his were ignored. He accused the FBI and the Department of Justice of failing to brief lawmakers on the threat of domestic terrorism. He sent the letter just 4 hours before the attack in New Zealand. And police arrested a suspect there who praised American white supremacists. Now, the reason for the congressman's anger is this: more domestic terrorism suspects were arrested in the United States over the last 2 federal budget years than those inspired by Islamic foreign extremists. The Washington Post reported that last week, citing figures from the FBI themselves. But the thing is, most domestic terrorism suspects are right-wing extremists, and domestic terrorism is not a federal crime. So suspects are charged with weapons violations. Again, another set of personal experiences bothered me by reading that news story. Back in 1985, Sue and I had moved to North Arkansas. She'd had the opportunity. Her parents had moved down there to retire, and she had a chance to be a Christian educator at a church. And I got a job at a local radio station. But within months of us moving there was a 4-day standoff between the FBI, other federal officers, and a group called the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, which sounds very righteous. What had begun as a small Baptist congregation back in the 1970s had turned into a white supremacist organization that stockpiled weapons, did paramilitary training for the end times, practiced on special projects that they could do. And they had ties to the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mountain Church, and the Order, all dangerous white supremacist organizations. And it wasn't just that event alone that had bothered me, but the whole series of events that came after that. In the next couple of years, I had the opportunity to interview Tom Robb, the national director of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, who was one of those smooth-talking lawyer types that suddenly had become to the front of the Klan. And he said, "Oh, we're not a hate group. We're a white advocacy group." And then, of course, the bombing in Oklahoma City, which is tied directly to white supremacists and white nationalists. You know, the Southern Poverty Law Center has been tracking dangerous white supremacist and white nationalist groups now for years. And they have done nothing but grow over the decades. They have been present, active, and waiting in the shadows, and I'm not even beginning to associate them with our current administration. Forget that completely. They are there and have been there all along. They are starting to slip out into the open more and more, claiming that they are Christian organizations. Those were everything I had going in my mind this week. All these instances of hatred, bigotry, and violence. And then I looked at today's gospel lesson. Now, if you only concentrate on Jesus' words in that gospel, you might think, well, what's that got to do with this? Actually, I'm going to only look at the first sentence of that lesson. It's a very short one, and it's simply this. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." Now, I don't know about you, but usually when you hear the words Pharisees in the New Testament, you're thinking, oh boy, somebody's going to get it. Because Jesus likes to really stick it to the Pharisees, talked about all the things they've done wrong, or show them how wrong they are and how uptight they are about everything and the rules. The reality is the Pharisees weren't really bad guys. They're sure, of course, shown as opposing Jesus' actions almost all the time. But the thing is, the Pharisees were scholars and studiers of the law of Moses. Very careful teachers of that law. They weren't priests. They were people, though, who had watched their faith and their religion being changed by all the influences, all the different invaders that came through Palestine, all the travelers that came through, the influences of the Greek and the pagan religions, and now the Roman Empire. All of those things had an effect on their religion, and they were doing their best to hold on to their Jewish faith. And so they developed precise definitions of all the laws of Moses, all the things like the purification rites, the exact forms of work you could not do on a Sunday, and of course tithing, all the important things that they thought could enable them to hold on to their faith even while everything around them was swirling and trying to change it. But what we don't know is why the Pharisees would bother then to come and warn Jesus about Herod. Now, they didn't appreciate Jesus very much because, well, Jesus was telling people not to pay attention to all the things that they were telling them to do. And so they'd been concerned. Hard enough to deal with all those outside influences, but now add into one of their own, saying that you had to do things differently? Well, I'm sure they didn't like him all that much. But why warn him then? Some people say they were afraid, thinking that possibly if, of course, something were to happen to Jesus, and it was because of the Romans that his followers would rise up, there'd be violence, and there would be violence that would backlash against them. Others say, well, maybe they were just trying to tell him Herod was out to kill them so that he'd run away and quit doing what he was doing. I think it's something simpler. I think the Pharisees were doing what we all like to do in the church most of all. Not fellowship, not fun, but avoid conflict. Someone's just getting way too much fun out of that one. Avoiding conflict it's become an important part of who we are in the church, isn't it, though? You know, we even have vows that our church officers take that they will work for the peace and unity of the church. And the best way to do that is to avoid conflict. I told the earlier service, Sue and I, when we went to the church that we previously served in New Jersey, they'd had a history of some conflicts, and we knew that. And we said, well, you've worked on those, though, right? And they said, oh, yes, we've worked hard on dealing with conflict. Great. We came to find out that their way of dealing with conflict was to say, oh, we don't want to do that anymore, and then just ignore it. Well, it doesn't work so well. The thing is, conflict in itself is not bad. We've been trained to hear that. We think conflict, ooh, run away. Conflict is simply this, a disagreement between people and ideas. Conflict is a natural way of life. Trust me, there's conflict in our offices every day. As you see, there's a disagreement. There's a disagreement between ideas and people taking place right there. Most of us have had the experience of having disagreements with fellow church members. I've had disagreements with family members, with friends, but how you deal with it is something entirely different. Conflict is not good or bad all by itself, only in how we deal with it. Think about it. Jesus did not avoid conflict. In fact, Jesus was often the instigator of conflict, because it's often through conflict you learn things. Think about the stories where Jesus involved in conflict. He healed people on the Sabbath, knowing that he was going to annoy all the authorities by doing it, because he went against the law of Moses. He didn't condemn the adulterous woman when they expected him to, but instead he forced people to see themselves in her place. He kept company with tax collectors and prostitutes, again, something he wasn't supposed to be doing. But the thing is, if Jesus had avoided conflict the way we did and do, the sick would have continued to suffer, the condemned would have died, and those called sinners would still be outcasts. Jesus dealt with conflict, though, but not with violence, but using it as an opportunity to talk honestly, to teach. We don't even know about some of the many conversations he probably had with people about how you bring about justice. Jesus demonstrated an unanswering, unswerving devotion to following God's will no matter what the cost. That's all the stuff swirling in my head this week. As I looked at all those possible current events and some of the things that I'd experienced in the past that caused my reactions to it, and then I thought, and how do we address things like that? How do I respond to these things going on in the world as a human being, but also as a Christian? We like to think our faith is something that we can keep separate from those things, but not really. Especially when so many of the people involved are claiming the Christian faith as part of the basis for the way they do things. With so many of those individuals claiming Christianity as the basis for their version of religion, we have to speak out. To avoid conflict by not speaking out, by avoiding politics, and I don't mean to be political, it's not political to talk about compassion and talk about non-being judgmental and also not being anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. If you don't talk about those things, you suddenly give up the public pulpit to those that claim they have the only way of sharing the message of Jesus Christ, and it is not a message that I think is possible. If you think about it, Islam did not exist at the time of Jesus. It just wasn't there. So he didn't talk about being a Muslim. Since Jesus was Jewish, he wasn't telling people not to be Jewish. So if he wasn't telling them specifically to be Christian, which came much later, he wasn't telling them not to be Muslims or Jews, what was he telling them to do? To follow the will of God, to follow the way of the Lord. People that espouse viewpoints like white nationalism or white supremacist, and these are people, when they say things like, I'm a white nationalist, that means I don't accept people of other ethnicities as being important, only myself. There is no place for that in a world that follows the pathway of Jesus Christ. But I don't think people like that are any different than the Taliban are in Afghanistan. Some of the elements on both sides will use fear and violence to force their viewpoints on others. And just as the Taliban have distorted the Islamic faith, white nationalists and supremacists have often distorted our Christian faith. And how we respond, because you will have times when you will have an opportunity to respond in private and conversations with others, is important as any public responses you have. I know sometimes those conversations are uncomfortable. We were enjoying a birthday get-together at my brother's house last week over in Raymore, and all of a sudden his mother-in-law, who happened to be there, opened up her phone and said, "What do you think about this?" Well, let's just say it was a little political. I won't even get into what the specific thing was. Well, I just explained to her my viewpoint, why I thought what I did, and the experiences I had that formed it. Now, I guarantee you she did not change her mind. My mother long ago took her off of Facebook, even though they're mothers-in-law, but she didn't want to see her stuff. And her husband was over there nodding slightly behind her, but I'm sure they don't agree on it. But the thing is, we could have a conversation because we were civil to each other. Civility is the most underused capability that we have in the United States today. We've forgotten what civility is like. You can have disagreements, you can have differences of opinion, but civility is extremely important. But we have to talk about those things. When you don't talk about those things, not only do you give up your voice, you give up opportunities to understand maybe why the other person thinks the way they do. And then we start to automatically assume there's reasons they think something because they're not a good person, because they're stupid, or because whatever negative reason we can come up with, rather than trying to understand the basis for why they feel what they feel. There's no reason to avoid conflict. There's a reason to avoid being violent about it. There's a reason to avoid being silent about it. Civility is what makes it possible to have conversations and dialogue. But you have to remember, the words we speak are as tightly wrapped up within as the way we live. Jesus talks about following the way of the Lord. Paul, in his letter to the Philippians this morning, emphasized again how important it was to follow his example. Paul often did that in his letters. He'd remind them every now and then, just follow my example. If you can't do anything more than that, follow my example. Jesus wants us to follow his example. We can't live in fear of conflict, but we also can't live in fear of the kinds of things that are going on in the world around us unless we speak out. If we have honest, respectful conversations, we have dialogue, we deal with conflict, but we deal with it like human beings. As the words of Martin Luther go, at least they're attributed to him, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Your faith should have you standing there also, speaking out and speaking in the words of God. Amen.